So last week we discussed the fact that try to hang with me for like 5 weeks, okay? Because I'm setting the stage for something that is very important. Last week we discussed that there's a marked difference between a person going directly to God and a person going to a religious institution as a means to receive the same thing. We showed that God will never let you down, religious institutions will. God will never lie to you or hide things from you, religious institutions will. God will not send you off and not let people associate with you, religious institutions will. Instead of hacking at the branches and complaining about this church does this or this denomination teaches that, I want you to know what's truly driving and motivating the brick and mortar institutions and those who govern them. That's what we said last week. Now, my friend RJR, he called me and he said, I figured out what the motives of these institutions are at the core level. You may have done the same thing. But instead of just summarizing that churches are out to control us or to gather wealth, I am hoping to not just identify what they are ultimately after, but the means and systems they use to obtain what they are after, okay? So in other words, I want to know not only who's hiding behind the curtain saying, giving his orders, I want to know why he's hiding behind that curtain, why he wants to be there, his ultimate motivation for pulling this lever and announcing this and there, all behind the curtain, and what tools he uses to get people to do what he wants. What is he doing? Now, I mentioned last week that the Word of God delivers for us great things about how to know God, who Jesus is, the good news, His will. But outside of describing all these great things for us in the Bible, the Word of God doesn't talk too much about how the things in this fallen world operate. It doesn't cover that stuff very much. And we have to therefore learn about things in the world from people who are in the world. Now, you might disagree with that, but even the Word admits this. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians 2:11. This is what it says. For what man knows the things of a man except the spirit of man which is in him? That's how we know what men are about. It's by the spirit of man and women that's in us. We can understand men by the spirit of man that's in us. But he goes on and says, even so the things of God knoweth no man, but the Spirit of God. So spiritual things are discerned through the heavenly things, godly things are discerned through the Spirit of God, but things on earth are discerned through the spirit of man. To me, in order to understand man-made religion, again, to understand man-made religion, and what drives and motivates them and the tools they use to manipulate and control, we have to search the spirit of man and the wisdom of man to supply us with these answers. And so I traveled back through the woods of my lost years, 17 lost years, and I brought to the forefront of my mind endless hours that I churned. We were churning over in discussion and in time and long nights with different people, and then reading books and just churning and churning. And the hours I spent reading Machiavelli and Niccolo Machiavelli and Hermann Hesse and Rollo May and Erich Fromm and Ayn Rand, Erich Hoffer and Dostoevsky and Tom Gilovich and Bertrand Russell, a hardened atheist, and Voltaire and Victor Hugo and Thoreau and Nietzsche and Marx and Hegel and Kierkegaard and Sartre. And I went and I really got a baptism of the spirit of man for 17 years. I mean, I wasn't reading the Bible during that time. I was reading what men said about men. And to me, these people provide some of the best insights into what thrives in the spirit of man, insights and ways and means and faults and lies of the human heart. And so perhaps I thought by going back, I will gain insight into the motives of the world's master manipulators. And because within these insightful minds of these guys I just mentioned, these men and women I just mentioned, lie an understanding of what really manipulates and what really promotes greed and power and consummate evil in the heart of human beings. So through them, we can see the germs of totalitarianism and the fetid sway of mass movements and the dark powers of evil princes and the selfish nature of ambitious religionists. These guys write about that stuff and they make observations about that, and that's the spirit of man in them. So in terms of eternal value, it has very little. But in terms of being here on this earth, I thought, if I'm going to understand what is motivating these groups, well, I'm going to go back to some of these lessons. Now listen, in trying to get to the root of what motivates and governs the brick and mortars, I am not talking about understanding the ways and means of managers and of these brick and mortars. There's a huge difference in all systems and institutions between managers and true leaders. Huge difference when it comes to understanding them. Innumerable books have been written about the difference between managers and of institutional evil, those managers who are in place, who are typically timid and they're fearful and typically strive to maintain and sustain the status quo because managers want to keep their position. So managers within an evil empire, whether it's a government, a corporation, or a religion, they are just there to make sure everything continues to go like the top says because they want to keep their job. True managers do nothing outside of the box and merely follow orders. They were the guys who were the capos in the World War II death camps. They are the bishops and stake presidents in the LDS Church. They are the pastors of established denominations. They are the priests at the local Catholic Church. They're managers. And so while personal frustration is often something they deal with every day because they have good ideas and they're smart, they've sold their independence to the powers that be for security. They want security, and so they've sold their independence. They have their security. They have their 9-to-5 religious job, and they just cite rotely what denominational stuff is about. To study the ways and means of true managers within a system is traditionally the study of mediocrity. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. We do have to have managers, and they play a role, and they're usually made for that. But they originate very little. They venture out very less. They merely perpetuate and police the vision of the founder of the thing or the powers that be. A quick read of a guy named C. Northcote Parkinson tells you quickly the difference between managers and true leaders. Also, a guy named Ron Heifetz, a book by him. You read one book by Heifetz, you understand the difference between the two. So within the faith, outside of corporations and governmental powers, managers are traditionally found in the role of pastors and priests and preachers of denominations. Or they are also, if it's not a denomination, they are the second in command in a local non-denominational church. In my estimation, we will get much closer to the root of understanding the motives behind the brick and mortars and what they're trying to do. We could study 10,000 managers and we won't get to any closer to the root. You got to go to the top, the top brass to really figure out what's happening in our case. Having said that, we have to admit that managers do reflect the same drive for control that feeds the top, but they usually impose that on their local congregants. So you have a pastor or preacher or whatever of a local denomination who doesn't have any sway except for over his local congregants, and you'll see the same issues for power and control coming from the pulpit from them. So in any case, we're not interested in trying to understand the mindset of religious managers, nor the congregates who love to be governed by them. Those are two entirely different avenues of study, so I just had to mention that. What we do want to strike is the root of what the overall motivation, purpose, and the methods of the brick and mortars in religious institutions to govern and control, which are inferior to going directly to God, as we made that point last week. Coming out of Mormonism and breaking from its grip, I was able to see firsthand, just by looking over my shoulder once I was ready, the overabundance of what I would call evil parameters that were at work in what is otherwise considered a very good, wholesome religious environment. If you look at it from the outside or whatever, it's just a religious, good, wholesome environment. But there are evil manipulations behind the scenes from the top that are at play that keep the masses under the control of relatively few people. So claiming to be the intermediary between God and man, Mormonism, clean and scrubbed and efficient, is dripping with systems and teachings and demands that are antithetical to what Christ came to bring us, which is emancipation from rules and laws. These things that they are imposing really are the opposite. So again, if these ways that institutions use are not of God, what are they of? Where do they come from? What is the spirit, the zeitgeist behind these motivations that are not the way God works? And I know I emphasized that last week. So by examining what is obviously, if we can examine what they're seeking to achieve and accomplish over its members, total allegiance, the more a system can get total allegiance, obedience, utter devotion, if time, talent, money, and then, of course, psychological and emotional, spiritual and mental allegiance, ultimate control, we can then see what is motivating the system and the means it is employing to control its overall members. In a more specific way, this is the ultimate goal. The ultimate control of the masses by the few. That is the ultimate goal. There's always only going to be a few, and there's always going to be a lot that they want to control. This isn't original to me. Like I said, I'm not a smart guy. I'm just a guy who studies and researches and takes notes and watches. So I'm not coming up with this myself. So I stepped back and I had to ask, is this what is at the heart of Mormonism? What motivates it behind the scenes? The control of the masses by the few? Is this what motivates the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz? The control of all of Oz by one guy? Is this what the Catholic Empire is about? The Jehovah's Witness, the Southern Baptist, the non-denominational pastor in that little white church out in the country who's got just that whole community coming to his one place, the one over as much control as he can get without there being a mutiny, as much control as possible in every way as possible without there being a mutiny. Is that what's leading that guy to? Possibly. Seems to, at least. But what is the motivation behind this fairly ubiquitous drive? Where does it originate? Where does it originate? I'm saying this in a way so you'll ask yourself and you'll think, what is driving that motivation? Is it the non-God spirit that motivates a single pastor over a small flock in the country? Is that same spirit the same non-God spirit that motivates the Pope or the Mormon prophet? Or every other leader of major religious brick and mortars? Now, certainly, there are pastors and leaders who serve from the heart. And they serve because they love God. And they can be in very high position. And like I said last week, I think most of them are unaware what is driving them to do what they do and enforce what they enforce. I think they actually believe what they are doing is for God. So I don't think there's a sinister motivation behind them. I just think they don't realize it. So I want to know that spirit that moves them, these religious organizations, to dominate and control their flocks. The many, Because once we can understand that, we can recognize it. And once it can be recognized, then it can be challenged. And then once it can be challenged, it can be destroyed. And it can be abolished. And it can be refused. Once people just can sit down and say, I recognize it, oh, that's it. Oh, I'm going to challenge it, and now I'm going to destroy it by not participating. That is what will cause things to change down the road, probably 100 years. So I read Machiavelli when I was in my 20s, and I took out some old scraps of paper that I had written quotes on. Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims in his deceptions. That's an important quote in the things we talk about. He also said, it is much more secure to be feared than to be loved. And then he said, no enterprise is more likely to succeed than one concealed from the enemy until it is ripe for execution. These are really important principles from the Prince. I read and reread Rand and her objectivist views from the same period of my life. I read and reread Gandhi and Hoffer and Russell and Rollo May, read to search and understand, and then Das Kapital and Communist Manifesto, and discovered that I thought that those things would answer something, but they're as much of a joke in terms of wanting power over the masses by the few as capitalism. It's all in the same boat. So I have learned from men like Marx and Lenin, though, because about the tools used to manipulate and control. It was Lenin himself who said, a lie told enough times becomes the truth. A lie told enough times becomes the truth. Think about that when it comes to the LDS missionaries telling the first vision story. Just think about that when it comes to the repeated descriptions, mantras of God being a Trinity. The lie, and I'm sorry, it becomes the truth. And we hear it so much, we're just built to just hear it enough and then to accept it because it makes life easier and we acquiesce. It's what moves Madison Avenue. And if you're a Madman fan, that's what it's all about. It's manipulating the masses by the few. Think about the manipulation going on week in and week out from the pulpit, from the video presentations to the worship musics, to the presentations, to the subtle demands, to the overt demands for money, money, money. It is just this drumbeat. That is nothing to do with Christ, nothing to do with God and the good news. It is, and we've all accepted it just because we've been told the lie so many times, we think that's what it's supposed to be. And we accept stuff just blindly. I had a guy who was in a worship band locally. He told me after every performance or during the performance, they'd be like, okay, we're working them, a little louder, more bass. Okay, they're starting to move. They're starting to get up. That's a manipulation. You get what's happening when that happens? Your emotions are being tied up. How about some other great insights on manipulation? Listen to this quote. When it comes to controlling human beings, there is no better instrument than lies. Because you see, humans live by beliefs, and beliefs can be manipulated. The power to manipulate beliefs is the only thing that counts. When you can take people's beliefs and manipulate them, you're in control. And the very important quote, an applicable quote by Pablo Freire, it says, one of the methods of manipulation is to inoculate individuals with the bourgeois appetite for personal success. All right, these quotes are all going to come into play in the next 5 weeks as we set the stage. So I'm almost there for tonight. Some 20 years ago, I sat down and started to try to read a guy named Noam Chomsky. Now, of people who know say he is, quote, arguably the most important intellectual alive. Now, in your mind at home and here, ask yourself, do you know Noam Chomsky? How much do you know about Noam Chomsky? Can you understand Noam Chomsky? Now, interestingly, many people have no idea who he is or what he's about. In fact, more people today, probably 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more people know the Kardashians, who do nothing, than they know about Chomsky. And the fact is, in and of itself, it's more revealing, that fact I just said, than we might initially believe. Why it's this way and why it works in this way in this world is fascinating, because highly adept and accomplished men like Chomsky are unknown, relatively speaking, but inept and incapable fools have a public voice. That's how this world works. Because Chomsky exposes the machine for what it is, and the machine running full force on dark principles does not like the light or the exposure. It doesn't give Chomsky a second thought. Instead, it gives light and false attention, or real attention, to inept people instead of men like Chomsky. That's a principle that Ayn Rand brings out in her book, The Fountainhead, through a character named Ellsworth Toohey. And in Rand's epic book, The Fountainhead, there's a guy named Howard Roark, and he's the premier example of hard work and individualism at all costs, selfishness. He's not a really great character when you think about it, but he has an opposite named Ellsworth Toohey. He's a man who represents the spirit of collectivism, and which Rand indirectly describes as the spirit of non-creativity. Non-creativity. Toohey hates anything that's creative or superior or anything that rises above what the common group has decided is important. He hates it, and in large part because you can't control it. Toohey wants to control. And if you rise above what the masses are agreeing to, he knows it can't be controlled by him behind his little desk. And so this is the role that he plays. Therefore, in her book, Toohey is adored by the masses, and Roark struggles to survive or be known. That's what the whole book's about. So Chomsky is known for expertise in two distinct areas. He's known for expertise in linguistics, MIT professor in linguistics, and he's come up with some revolutionary stuff there. And also, he is known for what Socrates was known for, and it's called gadflying, which can be described as being a constant social irritant towards something or another. In Chomsky's case, toward the dark principles and the forces in politics, corporations, and major media outlets. Chomsky rips the heads off corporations, government, and major media outlets. And as mentioned, his criticism of the media outlets has led to him rarely being mentioned in the media outlets. So when we might suspect that there is a big brother operating things behind the scenes, Chomsky proves it. He proves it. Okay? Now, I don't worship men, and I don't care about Chomsky in terms of anything, except for he does know the spirit of man. And he has brought forth some principles that I have tried to understand through his books, and I'm 400 million light years behind this guy in intellect. So I'm trying to get what he's trying to get, and I wasn't able to do it until some guys, these two filmmakers came around, and they took 4 years compiling interviews of Chomsky. And they took the time to then explain what he is explaining when he talks. And when he talks, you need to, one sentence is so filled, it'll take you 3 weeks to follow up on research to support his one sentence, but it can be supported. So these guys, they put this documentary together, and they laid out Chomsky's words and how the few manipulate the masses. All right? Of course, Chomsky speaks mostly about big governments and corporations and major media at play. But I think we can discover, and this is going to be the final thing that we get to after 5 weeks, is through what he's discovered, through big corporation manipulation, government manipulation, and major mass media manipulation, we take that model and we apply it to brick and mortar religion. and it's the same. It's the same thing. And therefore, we can apply that model, and then we're going to be able to observe why the few want to manipulate the masses, what they accomplish by doing that, and how much they are, and how successful they are in keeping it alive. I believe that this is the spirit that is alive and well in today's modern day evangelicalism. And that is to keep, the way Chomsky puts it is, what they want to do is they want to make everybody spectators in the game and not participants. So whatever the powers that be can do to make us spectators, it keeps us out of their hair so that they can go on controlling the wealth, the power, the minds of everybody involved. And we're going to start talking about those principles next week. I know that was a lot tonight, a lot of stuff, but hang with me because I think you're going to find it worthwhile ultimately when it comes to talking about religion.